Hi everyone. Welcome back. We're glad to have you with us today. Let's start. During my second year of college, I was what you'd call a classic nerd. My world revolved around numbers, theories, and equations, leaving little time or interest for anything else. I spent most of my days hidden away in the library's quietest corners, where I could focus without the chaos of campus life pressing in on me. Social gatherings? Not my thing. Sure, I wasn't unattractive, but I had convinced myself that my devotion to academics meant romance wasn't in the cards. One evening, though, everything changed. Against my better judgment, I let a friend drag me to a party. I showed up with low expectations and spent most of the night nursing a beer in a quiet corner, doing my best to avoid the noisy crowd. The place was buzzing with energy, people laughing and dancing like it was the greatest night of their lives. I didn't belong there, and yet, as I sat there, staring into the froth of my beer, Sarah walked in. Sarah wasn't just another girl on campus. She was the kind of beauty that could stop time, or at least it felt that way to me. Her long legs carried her across the room with an effortless grace, her smile lighting up everything around her. She was magnetic, the center of attention without even trying. And then, impossibly, she headed straight for me. "Hey, what's your story?" she asked, leaning in closer than I was prepared for. Her perfume wrapped around me, a mix of vanilla and something spicy, making my pulse quicken. I froze. Up close, she was even more stunning than I'd imagined. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, and her lips curved into a smile that seemed to say she knew exactly the effect she was having on me. "You're different from the other guys here," she said, her voice dropping just enough to make my stomach tighten. "Why haven't you tried to talk to me like everyone else?" I stammered, trying to find words, but my brain wasn't cooperating. I didn't think you'd notice someone like me." I finally managed. She laughed softly, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. "Well, here I am," she said, brushing her hair back in a way that made my thoughts scatter. "And I've noticed." By the end of the night, we left the party together. From that moment on, my life was never the same. 2 years later, we were married. It was a whirlwind romance, the kind that felt too good to be true. Sarah was everything I wasn't: bold, adventurous, and undeniably sexy. She knew exactly how to turn heads, and I couldn't believe she'd chosen me. On our first night together, she taught me just how intoxicating it could be to love someone like her. The way she moved, the way she touched me, it was like she'd been crafted to drive me wild. And for years she did. Fast forward nearly 3 decades, and Sarah and I had built a life together. We'd raised 2 kids, shared countless memories, and navigated the ups and downs of marriage. But no matter how long we'd been together, Sarah still had a way of surprising me, sometimes in ways I wasn't prepared for. One evening, as we relaxed on the couch, she turned to me with a playful smile and said, "Oh my goodness, John, you're still unmatched in every way." Her words were warm and affectionate, but they hit me differently. Why was she comparing me to other men? The question lodged itself in my brain, refusing to leave. As I rested my head on her lap, Sarah ran her fingers through my hair, her touch as familiar as it was comforting. "You always know how to turn my world upside down," she added with a soft laugh. Normally, those words would have made me pull her closer, but that night, something about them unsettled me. When she noticed my silence, she asked, "What's wrong? Aren't you going to say anything?" I forced a smile. "No, I'm just tired, baby. You've drained all my energy tonight." The double meaning wasn't lost on her. She laughed, kissed me, and lay back down, falling asleep almost immediately. Normally, we'd spend time tangled up together before cleaning up, but that night, I slipped away to the bathroom, cleaned up alone, and headed downstairs for a drink. Standing in the kitchen, sipping a glass of rye whiskey, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. Most men wouldn't have overthought Sarah's comment, but my brain rarely shuts off. Was there something wrong in our marriage? Or was I just imagining things? On the surface, everything seemed fine, better than fine actually. Since our youngest had left for college 6 months ago, Sarah and I had rediscovered parts of ourselves that had been buried under years of parenting. She'd recently lost 20 pounds, returning to the weight she was when we met. At 51, she looked incredible, curves in all the right places, legs that could still make heads turn, and a confidence that hadn't waned with age. Her body was nothing short of divine, a fact she seemed well aware of. I'd always admired her self-assurance. From the moment we met at that Midwestern university, she'd been a force of nature. While I was the quiet math geek, Sarah was the queen of every room she entered. I'd never imagined a woman like her could even see me, let alone choose me. But she had, and for years she'd been my world. Dressed in a crisp white blouse that hugged her curves, Sarah leaned forward more often than necessary, letting her top hint at the body beneath. She noticed Brian's gaze drift, his eyes betraying his thoughts as they darted from her face to her neckline and back again. Each subtle glance only confirmed her effect on him, making her smile grow sly. Men are so predictable, she thought, swirling her wine glass. He's mine, but he doesn't know it yet. When I drop another 5 pounds, he'll get the gift of his life. Sarah's confidence had always been one of her most dangerous traits. She played her game masterfully, brushing her hand against Brian's forearm now and then, her touch lingering just enough to send a message. When she laughed at his jokes, her hand would casually rest on his wrist, her thumb grazing his skin. Brian's slight shiver didn't escape her notice. So easy, she mused, leaning closer under the pretense of pouring another glass of wine, her hair brushing his arm. Let him wait. The anticipation will make the payoff even sweeter. For months, I had no idea what was happening right under my nose. I had noticed Sarah's newfound energy and commitment to the gym. She was shedding weight quickly, her body transforming in ways I couldn't help but admire. Her confidence seemed to grow with each pound she lost. At first, I thought it was a midlife renewal, a spark reignited after years of focusing on the kids. But small changes in her behavior began to pile up. Canceled plans, late nights at work, and that occasional, almost imperceptible nervousness when she walked through the door. It wasn't until one evening, when I saw a strange text flash across her phone screen, that suspicion crept in. She left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. Normally, I would never invade her privacy, but the preview of the message caught my eye. I can't stop thinking about last night. It was from someone named Fred. My stomach churned, but I didn't touch the phone. Instead, I waited for her to come back downstairs, wondering if she'd address it. She didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, connecting dots I didn't want to see. Her newfound interest in fitness. The way she seemed more preoccupied with her appearance. The evening she'd come home late, flushed and out of breath, claiming she'd stayed for an extra session at the gym. It all felt too coincidental. I decided then that I needed answers. The next morning, I made the call. Hiring a private investigator wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I needed the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. A week later, the investigator handed me a thick envelope filled with photos, schedules, and notes that painted a picture I couldn't deny. Sarah wasn't just involved with one man. There were 3. The first was Brian Mitchell, a charming co-worker who Sarah had apparently been meeting after hours under the guise of business dinners. The second was Fred Logan, a younger man engaged to one of Sarah's colleagues, Rebecca. According to the report, Sarah had seduced Fred after a heated argument with Rebecca, determined to prove her superiority. What was supposed to be a one-time act of revenge had turned into something more. Then there was Aaron Reed, her gym trainer. The photos of them leaving the gym together, his hand resting casually on the small of her back, were impossible to misinterpret. The investigator didn't just provide evidence. He recounted an encounter he'd witnessed between Sarah and Aaron. During one of their one-on-one sessions, Sarah had leaned into him as he adjusted her form. His hands were firmly on her hips, and instead of pulling away, she pressed back slightly. From there, things escalated. The next time he followed them, they left the gym together and ended up at Aaron's apartment. The photos left no doubt about what happened inside. The night I read the report, Sarah came home from her workout glowing with energy. She was still in her gym clothes, her tank top clinging to her body and her hair slightly damp. "Tough session?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She hesitated, her eyes darting away as she mumbled something about needing a shower. I nodded and let her go, watching her disappear upstairs. The sight of her retreating figure, one I had admired for so many years, felt like a cruel mockery of the life we'd built together. The next evening, As Sarah was putting away dishes after dinner, the doorbell rang. She called out for me to check it, but I stayed seated. She answered the door herself and returned a moment later, holding a manila envelope. Her face was pale as she opened it, and when she saw the contents, her expression shifted from confusion to fury. "What the hell is this?" she hissed, clutching the papers. "How could you do this to me? What about our family?" I didn't raise my voice. "You're just mad I beat you to it," I replied calmly. "Let's be honest, Sarah. If I hadn't filed first, it was only a matter of time before you did." She looked as if I'd slapped her. "You think you know something?" she snapped. "Go ahead, say it. I'm all ears." I stood, pulling a small piece of paper from my pocket. "Brian Mitchell," I began, watching her eyes widen. "Fred Logan. Aaron Reed." Her face drained of color, and she sank into the chair behind her. "You wouldn't have the guts to say any of this if you were a stronger man," she spat, her voice trembling. I sighed, feeling more exhausted than angry. Apparently, 29 years wasn't enough for you to learn about loyalty. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped, realizing I wasn't bluffing. "I won't let you lie your way out of this, Sarah," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside. "You chose to cheat while we were still married, and now it's public. All you had to do was respect me enough to divorce me first." Instead of taking accountability, Sarah retaliated by spreading rumors about me. She whispered to mutual friends, and apparently their wives, that I was terrible in bed. I heard it from one of the guys at work, who chuckled as if it were a harmless joke. But it wasn't. She thought I'd crumble under the weight of the embarrassment, that I'd beg her to stop. She was wrong. The hardest blow came when my youngest daughter, Allison, confronted me. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling with anger and confusion. "Mom said you're stalking her to get back at her. Is that true? Are you doing this just to soothe your ego?" Her accusation struck me harder than anything Sarah had ever done. I stared at Allison, my heart breaking as I realized how far Sarah was willing to go to vilify me in front of our children. "If your mom wants to play dirty, then I'll play along," I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "She probably told you about the affair, didn't she? But did she mention the 3 men she's been with?" Allison's face froze in disbelief. "3, I emphasized, holding up 3 fingers for effect. "Not 1, not 2, 3 men, all a little older than you." "3? Allison stammered, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. She wouldn't, doesn't she love you? Doesn't she love us?" "She doesn't need to love me anymore, Allison," I said bitterly. "But she didn't have to sleep with 3 guys either. And trust me, they're closer to your age than mine." Allison's face crumpled, and she burst into tears, fleeing the room. She left my apartment looking lost. Her footsteps hurried as she disappeared down the hall. It took everything in me not to chase after her, wrap her in my arms, and take back everything I'd said. But I couldn't. The truth was ugly, and there was no way to soften it. About 20 minutes later, the phone rang. Sarah's mother, Barb, was on the other end, and she wasn't wasting any time. "How could you say such horrible things to my granddaughter? You idiot!" she screamed. "She adored you, and now she's crying on my couch, completely devastated. What is wrong with you?" "Barb," I said evenly, trying to keep my voice calm. "You've only heard one side of the story," Sarah sighed. "You don't know the truth." "I don't need to hear your side," she shot back. "What you said to Allison was unforgivable." "Sarah's been with 3 men," I said, cutting through the noise. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "If you don't believe me, I have proof." "Oh my God," Barb whispered. "John, do you have pictures? Videos?" "Yes," I replied quietly, hating how clinical it sounded. I didn't want it to come to this, but Sarah left me no choice. "No," Barb said, her voice trembling now. "That won't be necessary. I'll talk to her." There was a pause before she added, "I'm so sorry, John. Truly." When the line went dead, I sat staring at the phone. Barb had been like a second mother to me since my own dad had passed away. Now, I'd had to shatter her world with the truth about her daughter. It felt like a cruel betrayal of the bond we once had. The divorce was finalized on the grounds of infidelity, though Sarah fought hard to have it changed to irreconcilable differences. She begged me over the phone one evening. No one needs to know our personal business, she insisted. Just change the reason, and I'll sign immediately. Sarah, I replied, tired of her manipulations. I know you think I'm some awkward geek who'll fold under pressure, but your logic is transparent. I won't let you rewrite the truth just to save face. Life after the divorce became unexpectedly interesting. About a month after filing, two women from the university's science department stopped by my basement office to check on me. Though I barely knew them, their concern was nice. Both were attractive. One divorced in her 50s, the other widowed in her 40s. Over the next few weeks, women I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly seemed eager to reconnect. One day, as I was leaving my office, Colleen, the administrative secretary in the math department, gave me a radiant smile. "Okay, John," she teased, her green eyes sparkling. "Spill it. Did you inherit some money or something?" "What are you talking about?" I asked, genuinely confused. "You seriously have no idea, do you?" she said, laughing. She was a curvy, raven-haired 35-year-old who carried herself with effortless confidence. "It's because of your recent weight loss," she said, making air quotes and tapping her own ring finger for emphasis. "You lost 120 pounds. You're single, nice, smart. You're a rare find. And now, everyone knows you're available." It was surreal. I'd gone from being a married man with a mundane life to someone at the center of attention. And while it was flattering, I couldn't help but wonder what Sarah thought about all of this. Her attempts to humiliate me had backfired spectacularly. Sarah's first official night as a divorced woman wasn't what she'd hoped for. After an awkward dinner with Brian Mitchell, she found herself back at his apartment. But as he reached for her, sliding his hands up her sides and pulling her closer, she felt nothing. When he pressed his lips to hers and let his fingers wander further, she gently removed his hands from her chest, murmured an excuse about being tired, and left. As she got into her car, she couldn't help but feel an unsettling emptiness. For all the freedom she thought she wanted, her first night as a single woman was a resounding disappointment. Meanwhile, I was navigating life on the other side of divorce. 2 weeks after the papers were finalized, I sat across from Judy Sanders at a small Italian restaurant, trying to figure out what came next. Judy wasn't just anyone. She was a longtime friend of both Sarah and me, someone I trusted to keep things simple. This wasn't about rekindling a past spark. We didn't have one, but rather stepping into a world I hadn't been part of for decades. Over a glass of red wine, I confessed, "Judy, I thought I had women figured out. After 30 years with Sarah, I assumed I knew what made you all tick. Turns out I was just fooling myself." Judy smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with amusement. She had a way of looking at you like she could see straight into your thoughts. "You're not alone there, John. Understanding women is an art, not a science. But here's a tip. Don't overthink it. Just live your life, and let us surprise you." Judy was a couple of years younger than me, but she carried herself with a timeless grace. Her dedication to yoga kept her fit, and her smooth skin seemed to defy her age. As we talked, I found myself noticing things I hadn't before. The way her dark brown hair fell over her shoulders, the softness of her laugh, the curve of her figure beneath her simple dress. For the first time, I entertained the thought of her in a different context, imagining what it would be like to share more than just conversation. "I was hoping you'd call eventually," she admitted, taking a sip of her wine. "I didn't expect to be the first on your list, but I'm honored. That said, let's not spend the evening talking about Sarah. We've both moved on, right?" I nodded, grateful for her directness. "You're right. Moving forward means looking ahead, not back." With that, I leaned in and kissed her, a bold move for someone out of practice. To my relief, she responded enthusiastically, leaning across the table and kissing me back with an intensity that left me breathless. By the time she pulled away, I was certain my face was flushed. We finished dinner with cheesecake and coffee, but the night didn't end there. "I think we should continue this conversation at my place," Judy said, her tone playful but her eyes serious. "If I'm not mistaken, you haven't had much experience since Sarah, have you?" She was right, of course, and the thought made me uneasy. "It's been a while," I admitted. "I'm not 21 anymore, Judy. I don't want to disappoint you." Her laugh was light, reassuring. "Relax, John. This isn't a test. It's just two people living their lives." When we got to her house, She excused herself to change into something more comfortable. My head was spinning as I waited, unsure if I was ready for what was coming. Judy returned a few minutes later in a short terry robe that barely reached her thighs. The thin fabric left little to the imagination, and when she sat beside me on the couch, the faint scent of her perfume filled the air. We talked for a while, our conversation drifting effortlessly from light-hearted banter to deeper topics. But eventually, Judy leaned forward, took my coffee cup from my hands, and set it on the table. Without a word, she stood and extended her hand. I followed her to the bedroom, my heart racing. Inside, she undressed me slowly, her hands gentle but confident. "Take it easy," she whispered, noticing my hesitation. "We've got all the time in the world." The night unfolded like a revelation. For the first time in years, I felt seen, not as a husband, not as a father, but as a man. As we lay side by side afterward, Judy turned to me, her blue eyes full of warmth. "You're irresistible. You know that?" she teased. "Well, that's why I'm here," I replied with a grin. She laughed, nestling closer, and we fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee brewing and the sound of bacon sizzling in the kitchen. When I found Judy downstairs, she was wearing my shirt, her legs bare beneath the hem. "Hope you don't mind," she said, her voice soft. "I like the way it smelled. It reminded me of you." For the first time in a long while, I felt hopeful about the future. Life was changing, and for once, it didn't feel like a bad thing. Judy hadn't expected the whirlwind of emotions that followed her first encounter with me after the divorce. What she thought would be a one-time, curiosity-driven fling had quickly turned into something far more personal. She had known me for years, first as a friend, then as Sarah's husband, but she hadn't anticipated how deeply our connection would resonate. Our dates weren't just enjoyable, they were unforgettable. Judy found herself marveling at how attentive I was, not just in conversation, but in every touch, every glance. "This man is a master at making a woman feel desired," Judy thought to herself as she lay awake one night, replaying our most recent evening together. She couldn't help but wonder, is he always this good? When Judy made the mistake of mentioning our time together to Sarah, it was clear Sarah hadn't expected such high praise. "You've been out with John?" Sarah asked, arching an eyebrow. "And you're saying he's good? Like really good?" "Good doesn't begin to cover it," Judy said, her cheeks flushing. "He's smart, sweet, and well, let's just say you're crazy for letting him go." Sarah's smile vanished, replaced by a strained expression. She quickly sipped her margarita, her fingers tightening around the glass. "Well," she said, raising her eyebrows in mock surprise, "I guess he's just full of surprises." Judy could tell her words had hit a nerve, so she let Sarah change the subject, though it was clear the conversation had left her unsettled. Meanwhile, my life continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Molly Hamilton was pressed against me, her hand resting lightly on my chest as she drifted off to sleep. Her rhythmic breathing filled the room, the only sound after what had been an exhausting but exhilarating night. It wasn't lovemaking, it was raw, passionate, and left me feeling sticky, spent, but satisfied in a way I hadn't felt in years. As I lay there, I couldn't help but reflect on the irony. Sarah had cheated on me because she claimed I couldn't satisfy her. Yet here I was, having had the best sex of my life with the third woman I'd been with in 3 months. Women, I thought with a shake of my head, were a mystery I would never fully unravel. I'd met Molly at the gym, of all places, a cliché perhaps, but one that had worked in my favor. She was focused, sweat dripping down her face as she powered through her workout. Her dedication caught my eye. She wasn't there to turn heads or find a date. That made her all the more attractive. I waited until she finished, casually approaching her by the lockers. "Hi," I said, feeling a twinge of nervousness I hadn't experienced in years. "I couldn't help but notice how hard you were working out. Maybe you'd let me treat you to coffee and dessert sometime?" She hesitated, studying me for a moment. Then, with a small smile, she agreed, typing her number into my phone. Before she walked away, I called out, "How about Thursday evening?" She turned, her ponytail swishing, and smiled again. "Thursday it is." That Thursday, I arrived at Lowe's Cafe a little early and secured a small table in the back. Molly walked in 2 minutes later, her long blonde hair, pulled into a ponytail and her athletic frame accentuated by tight jean shorts and a cropped t-shirt that revealed her toned stomach. She wasn't dressed to impress anyone, but the results of her gym routine were impossible to miss. As she sat down, her braless chest moved slightly, catching my eye. She noticed, raising an eyebrow in question, but when I smiled and nodded, she smirked in response. We spent the next 2 hours talking over cheesecake and coffee. Her laugh was infectious, her wit sharp. She wasn't much older than my daughters, and yet I felt a connection I hadn't expected. When I walked her to her car, she leaned in and kissed me softly, a promise of what might come next. That promise was fulfilled the following weekend, after a visit to an antique car museum and dinner at a quiet restaurant. Back at my apartment, we abandoned any pretense of subtlety. Molly's dedication in the gym clearly translated to other areas of her life. As I drifted off to sleep beside her, my thoughts flickered between disbelief and gratitude. For someone who had been told he wasn't enough, I seemed to be doing just fine. Across town, Sarah was having a very different experience. She had spent the evening with a younger man she'd met at a bar, indulging in a desperate attempt to recapture the thrill she thought she'd lost. But as his hands moved over her body and his kisses grew more insistent, she found herself distracted, detached. Even when he tried to please her, she couldn't bring herself to care. As she drove home, she glanced at herself in the rearview mirror. She looked good, damn good for her age. But despite her reflection, something felt off. She thought about Carl, the man who had recently ended their relationship. He had wanted marriage and children, things she couldn't give him. His departure had been polite, even kind, but it still stung. First John, now Carl. Twice in a row, she'd been left behind. Sarah tried to rationalize Carl's departure by telling herself the sex had grown stale, but the truth gnawed at her. For someone who had built her confidence on being irresistible, the idea of being unwanted was unbearable. This shouldn't be happening to someone like me, she thought bitterly as she pulled into her driveway. As Sarah pulled into her driveway, she exhaled a long, weary sigh. The night had been a disappointment, another in a string of failed attempts to reignite the excitement she'd once thrived on. She told herself that next time, she might aim for someone closer to her age. Sure, they might not be as striking as the younger men she'd been chasing, but perhaps they'd have more to say, something she could actually connect with. The empty thrill of physical attraction wasn't enough anymore. On the other side of town, I lay in bed, reflecting on everything I'd learned since Sarah and I parted ways. Spending time with Molly had only solidified a belief I'd held quietly for years, one I never dared to share during our marriage. From the start, Sarah had been a goddess in every sense of the word, confident, stunning, and completely aware of her ability to draw men in. But in my experience, women like Sarah often didn't put much effort into intimacy. They didn't have to. Men were happy just to be there, reveling in their good fortune. With Sarah, there was always something missing. While we'd had a few gentle conversations about it over the years, I never told her how I truly felt. It would have sounded cruel, even if I didn't mean it that way. Instead, I focused on what I loved about her and accepted the rest. But now, after being with Judy, Katie, and Molly, I finally understood the difference between merely good and truly great intimacy. These women had shown me what it meant to connect fully, without ego or pretense. 2 weeks later, the phone rang, and to my surprise, it was Sarah on the other end. I hadn't spoken to her in months. When I was with my daughters, they carefully avoided talking about her, knowing I didn't want to rehash old wounds. I told them from the beginning, I wanted them to love and respect their mother, but my relationship with her was over, and they needed to respect that boundary. To their credit, they had. John, Sarah began hesitantly. April wants to know if we can be civil at her wedding. Robert finally proposed, and she wants us both there. She just doesn't want any drama. I paused, taken aback. You can tell April she doesn't need to worry. I'll be the perfect gentleman, I said. I'll remind her that you were the woman I once loved when she calls to share her news. The next day, April called, bursting with excitement about the engagement. I assured her I'd be on my best behavior and encouraged her to focus on planning the wedding of her dreams. Have fun, sweetheart, I told her. I'll take care of the costs. On the day of the wedding, as I walked April down the aisle, I found myself overwhelmed. My little girl, who used to play with dolls and sing silly songs, was now a beautiful, poised woman. The walk to the altar only took a minute, but in those 30 steps, a lifetime of memories flashed before my eyes. Tears of joy spilled down my cheeks as I handed her off to Robert, knowing she was starting a new chapter of her life. Later, during the reception, I stood at the bar nursing a single malt scotch. The music shifted to a slow song, and I saw Sarah on the dance floor with a much younger man. As I approached, I politely asked if I could cut in. The man hesitated, clearly unsure, but Sarah beamed at me and extended her hand, making the decision for him. "You don't trust me with these kids, do you?" Sarah teased, her tone light, but her eyes probing. "Half the guests think you're a flirt," I replied with a smirk. "That young man you sent away probably hoped he'd leave with the mother of the bride tonight." "And if that's what I wanted?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Then I'll bring him back," I said calmly. "But I figured you'd rather talk to someone who doesn't idolize Beyoncé." "Touché," she said, laughing softly. "You know, for a moment I thought April was going to have a panic attack when you walked over." "Well, we haven't exactly been mature toward each other lately," I admitted. "At least we waited until the girls were grown before we exploded," she replied, her tone tinged with regret. We danced through a couple of slow songs, exchanging light banter, before her previous dance partner returned to cut in. Sarah looked surprised when I agreed, but I didn't linger. I returned to my seat, where Ellie was watching the dance floor. "Do you think I'll have to worry about men chasing her when she's in a nursing home?" she asked, her voice joking, but her eyes betraying concern. "What about you, Dad?" she continued. "Mom says you're dating, but replacing her must be impossible." "I'm fine, Ellie," I said. "Better than fine. Your mom doesn't know as much about my life as she thinks. I'm not trying to replace her. I'll handle this in my own way." At that moment, Wendy Adams, an old family friend, approached. Her husband Earl and I had been best friends before cancer took him a few years ago. Wendy smiled warmly and asked Ellie if she'd excuse us. As Wendy took my hand, I realized the night wasn't over yet. As we stepped onto the dance floor, Allison watched us with an expression of mild surprise. Then, with a playful grin, she leaned over and whispered, "Coincidences like this only happen in movies, Daddy." I chuckled and gave her hand a squeeze before Wendy and I moved to the rhythm of the music. After a couple of songs, we left the dance floor and found 2 comfortable chairs at the bar just outside the hall. We talked about the wedding, catching up on the years we'd missed as our lives diverged. Wendy suddenly took my hand, her expression serious. Her blue eyes met mine as she asked the $664,000 question. "John, are you still in love with her? Because if you are, I won't make a fool of myself by inviting you to dinner." I hadn't expected that. Wendy had always been close to Sarah, and the idea of asking her out had never crossed my mind. She was beautiful, kind, and self-assured, but I'd always thought of her as Earl's wife, even years after his passing. "I'll always love her in a way," I admitted, choosing my words carefully. "Maybe it's more like an old habit I can't quite shake. But no, Wendy, I'm not in love with Sarah anymore. That chapter is over." Her lips curled into a knowing smile. "Good. Because, John, I'm not a girl anymore. I've been on my own for 8 years, and there aren't many men I find interesting. You're here. I'm here. And Sarah let you go. It's been 3 years since the divorce, and from what I hear, you're the #1 draft pick in the league of fantasy husbands. If only there were such a thing." She blushed as she finished, her confidence faltering for just a moment. Something about her vulnerability, so briefly exposed, tugged at me. I handed her my phone, and she typed in her number with a shy smile. Just as I was taking it back, April and Robert appeared, searching for me. April greeted Winnie warmly. "It's so good to see you again," she said, glancing curiously between us. Wendy smiled and excused herself, saying she didn't want to interrupt my father of the bride duties. As she turned to leave, I took her hands, leaned down, and kissed her softly on the lips. "To be continued," I whispered. Wendy's blush deepened, but she nodded before slipping away. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of wedding traditions. We cut the cake, danced with family, and celebrated April's big day. Yet I couldn't help but notice Sarah's proximity for the remainder of the night. She was practically glued to my side. Maybe April had told her about my conversation with Wendy. Maybe it was jealousy. Whatever the reason, I couldn't deny that her attention, however misplaced, was flattering. Later, as the guests began to leave and the festivities wound down, Sarah and I found ourselves alone in the hotel lobby. Knowing she had arrived by taxi, I offered her a ride home. To my surprise, she accepted, on the condition that I join her for a drink at the hotel bar first. It was the most amicable we'd been in years, so I agreed. We sat at a low table, the warm lighting casting a golden glow across her face. "The lady will have bourbon on the rocks, and I'll have a Staley," I told the waitress. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on her lips. "It's nice that you still remember," she said. "You're still the only woman I know who drinks whiskey properly," I replied with a grin. Then, without warning, she blurted out, "Are you going to have fun with Wendy Adams?" Her cheeks flushed as she quickly put a hand to her face. I didn't mean it like that. I regret saying it. Are you planning to date her?" Her embarrassment was palpable, and for a moment, I felt almost sorry for her. "Why does it matter?" I asked gently. Over the past few years, I had dated beautiful, intelligent women, but I'd never sought Sarah's approval or her jealousy. She pressed on, her tone softer. "You've dated so many women. I don't think you even missed me. Was it your plan to make me jealous, John? To sow your wild oats?" I raised my glass, staring into her blue eyes. She held my gaze, and for a moment, we sat in silence, the unspoken weight of our history pressing down on us. "That's a nice try, Sarah," I finally said, my voice even. "But I seem to recall someone sowing their oats while we were still married. To this day, you've never explained why you treated me so disrespectfully when I would have been happy to grow old with you." Before she could respond, she interrupted herself with a quiet, almost pleading voice. "Will this proposal still be discussed?" I was stunned, to say the least. My jaw dropped as I tried to process her words. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice breaking. "A terrible, stupid mistake. I was afraid of getting old, and I let that fear take control. I let it convince me that great sex with younger men would make me feel alive again." "I could still attract men like before," Sarah admitted, her voice soft but tinged with regret. "But the truth is, it wasn't what I thought it would be. It was just the thrill of having a new man, a young man, lust after me. I wasn't smart enough to understand it back then. I thought I was proving something to myself, but it was just empty. When I started comparing them to you, John, you came up short in my mind. Those kids could do things you didn't, but it was shallow. And I thought you were just a smartass, too kind, too sweet, too predictable. I was wrong." She took a deep breath and continued, her words more hesitant now. "After you left me, the game wasn't fun anymore. The thrill of being desired wore off. It became an ego boost, sure, but nothing emotional was happening. Damn it, John, I would have liquidated for a hug after good sex." Her voice broke slightly, and she wiped at her eyes. "Have you thought about dating someone your age? Someone who gets it. Someone who's in your league and understands life, even if they can't hit the high notes like those kids." I sighed, taking in the raw honesty in her tone. "Sarah," I said gently, "no matter how good you look, you're not 22 anymore either. It's time to accept that." She nodded slowly. "I know, and that's what I'm trying to do now. John, we had 30 good years together. Can you forgive my terrible mistake? My error in judgment? Can you be mine again, please?" Tears filled her eyes, large and glistening. Years ago, I would have taken her in my arms and promised to make the world right again. Even now, part of me wanted to, but after everything that had happened, her plea felt more like desperation than a heartfelt apology. I shook my head. "We had 29 good years together, Sarah. Let's not count that last one. But this is real life, and in real life, things don't always work out. Come on, let me take you home." Wendy Adams, as it turned out, ended what I called my second bachelorhood. A week after the wedding, I worked up the courage to call her. We arranged to meet at a seafood restaurant in a town nearby. Wendy arrived in a form-fitting dress that turned heads all night, though she didn't seem to notice. Unlike Sarah, who thrived on attention, Wendy's focus was solely on me. After a fantastic dinner filled with laughter and easy conversation, we returned to her house for after-dinner drinks. Wendy poured us each a glass of cognac, which we sipped as casually as if we'd done it 100 times before. When the glasses were empty, she stood, took my hand, and led me upstairs. The bedroom she took me to wasn't the master. It was a smaller, barely used guest room. I understood immediately. This wasn't a place that held memories of Earl, and I respected her unspoken decision. I didn't need her to tell me to be gentle. Wendy had loved Earl deeply, and it was clear she hadn't been with many, if any, men since his passing. I kissed her softly, savoring the warmth of her lips as I helped her undress. She reciprocated, removing my clothes as her hands traced my shoulders and chest. Her body, though slightly changed with time, was stunning, her bosom proud and full of life. Tenderness gave way to passion, and soon, I found myself overwhelmed by her fervor. When I looked up, her breath came in short gasps. She whispered, "John, that was incredible." I kissed her again, then lay beside her as we tangled ourselves together, her warmth grounding me in the moment. As she drifted into sleep, I watched her, her face serene and angelic. In the last 3 years since my divorce, I'd experienced a sexual renaissance, but this was different. Wendy was different. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. And for the first time, I wondered if she felt the same way. I fell into the deepest sleep I'd had in years, and when I woke the next morning, everything felt new. The scent of bacon filled the air, mingling with the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. I threw on some trousers and went downstairs, where I found Wendy wearing my shirt, just my shirt. The sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, the buttons only half done. She glanced over her shoulder as I entered, smiling warmly. "Hope you don't mind," she said. It smelled like you, and I didn't want to let go of that scent just yet. My shirt had never looked better. "How about breakfast?" I asked, spreading my arms as she sidled closer. When she stepped into my embrace, I pulled her tight, inhaling the scent of us still lingering on her skin. "This," I murmured, "is exactly where I want to be." We ate together, chatting about our plans for the day. It was a Saturday, and there was no rush, no schedule to follow. We didn't talk about what she was going to do, or what I was going to do. We talked about what we were going to do. In that moment, everything seemed to fall into place. "How about we get married today?" I asked Wendy, half joking but hopeful. She looked at me with a sly smile and replied, "You've got an excellent IQ, John. I'll do whatever you think is best." It was that simple. I called the local justice of the peace, knowing he kept Saturday hours, and confirmed a 4 p.m. slot. That left us just over 7 hours to prepare. I asked Wendy's son, Aaron, to be my best man. At first, he sounded confused, but when I explained that the bride was his mother, his tone changed to excitement. He promised to bring his wife and 2-year-old daughter to the ceremony. Wendy called her mother and put the phone on speaker as she asked her to be her maid of honor. Her mother burst into tears, managing a choked yes before hanging up. I then called both my daughters, inviting them to the wedding and letting them bring their significant others. Allison joked about whether she should bring her mother as a guest. "Only if you wanna," I said, "but honestly, I'd rather you didn't. She's had a rough time lately, and I don't want it to look like I'm rubbing this in her face." One of my closest friends owned a restaurant with a banquet hall, so I called him to see if it was available for a reception. "Anything for you," he said, and just like that, we had a venue. While I was picking out wedding bands at the jewelry store, Wendy ran into Sarah on the sidewalk. They hadn't been as close in recent years, but still exchanged polite conversation. Sarah's eyes widened when she noticed the rings on Wendy's hand. "Oh my God," Sarah exclaimed, her voice trembling. Are you married to John?" Wendy blushed, trying to steady Sarah as she swayed slightly. "It happened fast," Wendy admitted, "but it feels so right." Sarah forced a smile. "I get it," she said quietly. "I always knew I was an idiot for letting him go. Don't make the same mistake, Wendy. 10 years have passed since that whirlwind day, and I often marvel at how life unfolded. Wendy and I decided to buy our own house, a modest 2-bedroom with plenty of room for when the kids and grandkids visit. We've already become grandparents 6 times over. On weekends like this, I stand on the back porch grilling while Wendy brings out whiskeys on the rocks. She looks incredible for her 63 years, her light brown hair streaked with gray, but still capable of turning heads when we go out. We're not dead yet, after all. Medical science is a gift, and let's just say our nights together are still full of life. Even though I love Sarah deeply during our marriage, I can't imagine not spending the rest of my life with Wendy. She captured my heart in a way Sarah never did. In some strange, twisted way, I should be grateful for Sarah's betrayal. Without it, I never would have found this happiness. I still run into Sarah occasionally. She hasn't looked well for a long time, her once radiant confidence now overshadowed by sadness. She always apologizes, and though I never say it out loud, I sometimes want to thank her for making the choices that set me free. At 65, Sarah's appearance has softened. She still carries herself with a trace of her old pride, but it's clear time has worn away the pedestal she once stood on. As she walked through the mall parking lot one afternoon, she saw me approaching and straightened her posture. "Hello, beautiful," I said warmly, leaning down to kiss her cheek. She blushed, the compliment catching her off guard. We talked briefly, mostly about our grandchildren, before I glanced at my watch. "I should get going," I said, stepping away. As I turned, I knew what would come next. "John, I'm really sorry," Sarah said, her voice quiet, almost pleading. I paused, meeting her gaze. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I simply smiled, said nothing, and got into my car. I didn't need to respond. My life had moved forward, and I had no intention of looking back. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you soon.